Good evening, and welcome to our conversation this evening on voting rights. The struggle continues. We will be focusing tonight on how we can be involved in learning about what to do about the suppression tactics going on in voting rights. My name is the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, and I'd like to just open up this evening with a word of prayer. Let's look to the Lord. Holy One, it's once again that we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We're grateful to you that you have brought us together with such wise and brilliant women who will share tonight about the way that we can be involved in voting, the way that we can encourage others to vote, the way that we can make the way clear for those who've been shut out and shut down to gain access to the franchise of voting in our nation. As we gather now, we ask that the gift of your Spirit would inhabit each and every person that speaks, that their wisdom would be filled with your wisdom, that their instruction would be motivated by your instruction, that they would be empowered by your power. As we come before you with great gratitude in our hearts. We call on you by many names, but in all of them, we are grateful to you and ask that you would always use us for your purposes. Amen and amen. I'd like to welcome you tonight to the third installation in this conversation, The Struggle Continues. Tonight, we're going to talk about what we can actually do to deal with the voter suppression tactics, to deal with the fact that so many people have been shut out of voting. So many people have given up on the idea that voting matters. So many people need to be brought back to the polls to participate. We're part of the Reimagining America Project. And the Reimagining America Project is literally an effort to bring about truth and reconciliation in our country. We need the truth. We need to know about the history of our racialized past and the way that it continues to impact people's lives. I know that we often talk about the struggles that our ancestors fought, sitting in at lunch counters, fighting in various ways in our court system, striving to get people the right to vote as they drove through the South as freedom riders on buses, all seeking equal access to all the rights, power, and privileges associated with being an American citizen. We know that so many people have struggled particularly for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act was not passed easily. It was passed only after great sacrifice and great compromise. So much blood was shed in so many different places by so many different people. Our right to vote has never come cheaply. It's been a very expensive right to gain access to. Our franchise, I shouldn't say right, because if it were truly a right, it could not be taken away so very easily. As we come together today, we come together as part of the third look at voting. On the 23rd of February, we came together to have a conversation on the historical impact of race on voting. Then we came together last Thursday night, the 17th of March, for a hearing on the racialization of voting. Tonight, as we've looked at the various problems historically and in the contemporary world about the way that voting has been hampered, we are excited to hear that there is hope, that there are opportunities to do some good work going forward. Joining me this evening are Ms. Shemaya Haynes, a community organizer and the project leader of the Charlotte Community Think Tank. She'll serve as the moderator for our conversation this evening. In addition, we have Rotrina Campbell from the Center for Common Cause, the North Carolina engagement organizer for this organization. And we also have Alexandra Wolfson from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, who serves as a legal fellow, who will talk with us. And then we'll also hear from Ms. Andrea Miller, the founder of the Center for Common Ground, People Demanding Action, and so many other organizations that have truly reminded us, what does it mean to be part of a democracy? And what does it take to make this democracy work for you? I'm grateful that you all are joining us today. And I want you to know that I want you to participate as much as you can with the Reimagining America Project. This is the group that needs each and every one of you if we're to be effective at addressing the way that race continues to shape people's lives. We believe that we can move beyond race and we can move towards a more just and more equitable nation. But again, that will only happen if we all begin to work together toward that common goal. Thank you so much for your time. And I turn it over to you, Shemaye. You are muted.
Thank you, Reverend Sadler. I'm so glad to be here with this expert panel tonight. This Reimagining America project, racialization of voting rights series has been such a powerful wake-up call to many in our community, and we're eager to get to work on ensuring equitable democracy. Our first speaker will be Alexandra Wolfson.
And I'm so happy to be here and talk with all of you. It's a real privilege to be part of this. And so one of the things that I'd like to talk about in terms of voting rights is one example of the way that voting rights have been attacked, and the way that this attack on voting rights disproportionately affects communities of color who for decades have worked so long to achieve the right to vote and now see it being attacked from a number of different areas. So one example of this that we've seen, in really a decade now is the voter ID law. Voter ID, I think, is, an example of the way that voting rights are attacked really for the sake of attacking voting rights. Because we hear about voting rights, we hear about voter ID, the justification for it is voter fraud. Well, that's not an issue that exists. A voter ID law could really only stop in-person voter fraud. And that's just not an issue in North Carolina. That's not an issue in the United States. So the only reason that we see these voter ID laws being implemented in North Carolina and elsewhere is deliberately to suppress the votes of voters of color who are disproportionately likely to not have voter ID. So in North Carolina, we saw the first iteration of the voter ID law back in 2013. And that law was struck down by the Fourth Circuit of the United States courts as intentionally racially discriminatory. So the North Carolina General Assembly, after hearing the court say that they couldn't implement that was discriminatory, basically did exactly the same thing with voter ID 2.0. So in 2018, the North Carolina General Assembly passed another voter ID bill, which was basically an updated version of the one that had already been struck down. And the thing about voter ID, I think, is it shows, one, just how targeted these attacks are, but two, that when we hear from community activists and when we engage the voices of people who are affected by these and fight back against these kind of laws, we win, we're victorious. And a voter ID was an example just of that. This voter ID law was intentionally discriminatory. Voters of color are disproportionately likely to not have ID, photographic ID. And then on top of that, when the North Carolina General Assembly enacted this law, the IDs that they said were compliant with the law were IDs that white voters were disproportionately likely to have, including military IDs. And the IDs that they said were not compliant were IDs that Black voters were disproportionately likely to have, including federal IDs from public assistance programs. So not only was just the rationale of the law discriminatory, but the implementation of the law and the passage of the law was also intentionally racially discriminatory in a very targeted way. In response to that, we saw community mobilization, we saw activity. And in 2021, just this past fall, a North Carolina Superior Court did strike this law down. It found that it was racially discriminatory in violation of the North Carolina Constitution. And we heard some really powerful facts that just show how discriminatory it was. One thing that I found extremely powerful was the story of one individual who was a Black voter in North Carolina, and he'd been voting for decades in the same place. His family had lived there for decades at that point, really was on first name basis with the people who ran the polling locations, but he was disenfranchised because of this new voter ID law. So that's the kind of thing that was intended through the law and the kind of results there were. So fortunately, the North Carolina Superior Court did strike that law down for, all the reasons that are obvious just from the face of the law and from looking at the way it affects people. So as of now, the voter ID law is not in effect in North Carolina, and this tool of disenfranchisement is not activated. That shows that when communities do engage and communities talk about the effects, talk about the rationale behind these laws, there are tools to push back against these and to score victories against disenfranchisement.
Thank you. My apologies to Alexandra. I didn't have your bio initially when we started. So before I take Q&A, I want to give you I want to go ahead and give you the respect of the audience, knowing a little bit more about who you are other than your name. And my apologies for not going in order here. Alexandra Wolfson serves as a legal fellow with the voting rights team at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. She joined SCJS in September 2021. Alexandra graduated cum laude from Harvard Law School in May 2021. During her time at law school, Alexandra worked with Fair Election Center, Protect Democracy, and as a student advocate in the Harvard Housing Law Clinic and the Harvard Health Law and Policy Clinic. Alexandra also served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review, president of the Harvard Law School, ACLU, and external affairs director of the Women's Law Association. Prior to law school, Alexandra graduated magna cum laude from Brown University with a bachelor's in history. She subsequently worked in international development and education. And thank you so much, Alexandra, for being here. At this time, we're gonna pose at least one question. And so at last week's hearing, Democracy NC Western Piedmont Regional Director Kamaria Lawrence spoke about constitutional obstructions designed to deny people of color voting power. Ms. Wolfson will address recent oppression. My apologies, that is not a question. What processes are in place to protect Black and Brown voters from illegal intimidation and the spread of disinformation that directly suppress civic engagement in impacted communities?
Yeah, I mean, voter intimidation we've seen is, one more tool in addition to voter suppression, racial gerrymandering, really a whole arsenal of tools that have been used to prevent Black voters from exercising their constitutional right to vote. There are laws that are in place to prevent exactly this type of behavior. There are several federal laws that penalize voter intimidation. And voter intimidation can take a variety of forms, we know. One thing that we've historically seen is mailers directed toward Black voters, giving them misinformation about voting dates, giving them misinformation about the qualifications to vote, and threatening them with legal action if they exercise their constitutional right to vote. That's a form of voter intimidation. Voter intimidation we've seen can also occur at polling locations when people are physically intimidating people who are exercising their right to vote. And it can be through outright violence or outright threats. It takes really so many different forms. And the federal laws in place to counter the voter intimidation addresses all of these. They impose fines, they impose jail time. So there are protections in place to make sure that there are consequences for the people who do this. And one of the things I would note is that one of those laws that does penalize voter intimidation is actually the KKK law, because this is part of a long history of intimidating voters and trying to stop Black voters from exercising their right to vote. And the struggle really continues, and community activists are continually working with communities to make sure that voters have the right to vote.
Thank you so much for that. How can we how can we stop Black voters from being disproportionately removed from the voter list and registered rolls?
Yeah, and that's another issue that we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, really come to the forefront. In fact, in North Carolina, we saw 2 recent suits that were instigated by opponents of democracy and opponents of all communities and communities of color exercising their right to vote. And these suits were directed at boards of education and said in the complaints that they thought the boards of education weren't properly maintaining their voter rolls. And fortunately, one of the suits has been thrown out, and we're confident that that will continue to be the case for these suits because they're really unfounded. The North Carolina Board of Elections and local elections boards do in fact maintain voter rolls. It's just that the process in place under the federal law is designed to stop people from being improperly kicked off the voter rolls. So North Carolina, in fact, has a record of being pretty aggressive about it. Just last year, for its standard voter maintenance roll, it removed 400,000 people from the rolls. So the protections are in place, and we hope that those will be employed by the courts to stop people from bringing these types of frivolous suits. The other thing communities can do is just to encourage voter registration. And in fact, voter registration in person during early election periods is the law in North Carolina. So there are a bunch of opportunities for people to be able to vote online, in person, during the voting process itself. So exercising those opportunities is so important for voters.
I want you to maybe help some of our viewers and listeners understand the power and the value of early voting as we talk about all of this, because I don't think people really understand that early voting is actually more of an opportunity than just to vote early. So if you could just tell us about that.
Sure. Early voting takes place in the period before the official election day. And that's really powerful because, number one, it provides an opportunity for people to vote at a time that's convenient for them. Especially people who have demanding jobs, people who don't have flexibility in their jobs. It can be really difficult to wait online for hours on election day to be able to exercise their constitutional rights to vote. Early voting provides a more flexible window where people can exercise their right to vote at a time that is more convenient for them and that allows them to vote in a way that they feel comfortable with. The second thing that's really powerful about early voting is that if more people vote early, then there are less people voting on election day. So for election administration, it's also very helpful. It decreases the lines, it ensures kind of a smoother process. So it's part of general election administration and functioning, as well as giving people the opportunity to vote early, which of course, facilitates the franchise and facilitates an active democracy. And the other thing about early voting is that historically, it's been used by voters of color to a really significant extent. And, unfortunately, because of that, it's come under attack and it was eliminated in the 2013 bill. But again, fortunately, because of the community activists and the voices of people who were affected, the federal courts did overturn that. And we still have early voting today because of, the work of activists.
What about if a person wants to change something or needs to change something as far as their voter registration? Do they have an opportunity to make those changes during early voting?
Yes, they do. Early voting, you can register to vote, you can make the changes to vote, and it provides an opportunity if people move to a different precinct, for example, a different part of the state. That's a time to make those changes and still exercise the right to vote.
Thank you so much. We do have a question in the chat box. In the Q&A box. And it says, one of the panelists last week shared he was turned away from the polls because of lack of the correct ID. What should voters do if they show up at the polls and the validity of their IDs are challenged? What recourse do they have at this time?
Well, at this moment, they shouldn't have to show voter ID. That law is not in operation in North Carolina because courts have found that it was intentionally racially discriminatory. And that kind of law can't stand in North Carolina. Unfortunately, we see people turned away because of confusion over rules, because of lack of funding of election administration sometimes. There are a variety of reasons people can be turned away. There is a voter hotline that people can call. And if people are denied their right to vote, they should make sure that they're informing the election administrator of their rights, that they're there to vote, call the hotline if need be. And if worse comes to worse, make sure that they have the full information about provisional voting and that they're making sure their vote is counted.
We don't have any more questions in the Q&A box. So if you could just spend like maybe 30 seconds telling us what a provisional ballot is, for those of us who may not really know what that is.
Sure. A provisional ballot is if there is something wrong with someone's voter registration and they can't fix it, or there's some problem, and at least historically, if someone didn't have voter ID when the voter ID law was in effect, then someone would cast what's called a provisional ballot and then have to go to the county election office afterwards to make sure their vote was counted. It is more burdensome. But it is a kind of another resort if people really are denied the right to vote. But we don't want that to happen. We want people to show up and to be able to exercise their right to vote, easily and efficiently. So that's always the first priority and what community groups are working toward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and all of the valuable information that you share. We're really appreciative of all of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Next, we have Ms. Rotrina Campbell, and she is currently the Civic Engagement Coordinator for Common Cause North Carolina. She was previously a North Carolina redistricting organizer with Common Cause. Rotrina is a resident of Charlotte, North Carolina. She works throughout Charlotte-Mecklenburg to educate, engage, empower communities on the voter education, election protection, and advocacy through training, webinars, community conversations, and collaborative outreach. This February, Ms. Campbell's organization, Common Cause, celebrated a historic victory in striking down extremely gerrymandered maps in North Carolina and getting them replaced with fairer ones. Even with these districting maps, last week's hearing witness, activist and Mecklenburg City Council District 2 candidate, Kendrick Cunningham, spoke about the impact splitting communities has had on his district, splitting Black communities so their interests, needs, and issues are muted and area leaders can dismiss their demands without fear or consequences at the polls. Ms. Campbell, we ask you for your input and suggestions to mitigate the impact of cracking in our beloved communities. Welcome and thank you for your participation in this discussion.
Thank you so much. And the time and share my screen and just talk about a little bit what's going on. It's been a lot going on, so give me one moment. All right, I'm gonna, hopefully everyone can see my screen. So, okay. So I'm just gonna talk a little bit about what, gerrymandering is. I may have started, yes, so there we go. So gerrymander is when legislators draw voting districts in a way which gives one political party a significant and unfair advantage over another political party. In North Carolina, the state legislature has the power to draw our voting districts for the US Congress and the North Carolina state legislature. The governor cannot veto the maps. And for decades, unfortunately, the party in power has gerrymandered our voting districts. I want to give an example of packing and cracking, how gerrymandering forms of gerrymandering, should I say. Packing and cracking is one of the major two forms of gerrymandering. So let me move this so everybody won't see what I got. There we go. There we go. So there, okay. So packing is the party in power packs as many voters of the opposing party into as few districts as possible. As you can see where it says packing, that slither going down I-85 is where Black voters were packed into this district, as well as the same thing with the northeast side of North Carolina, where you have Black voters also packed into this district. Democratic voters as well packed into this district. So with cracking, and this was in the 2011 maps, and we also have the same thing here in cracking. This portion here, let me move it over. Yes, with cracking, this is A&T's campus, which is in Greensboro. I think everybody might be familiar with A&T. It was cracked. So literally the party in power split cities and communities, making it very difficult for a community to elect a representative of their choice. So A&T was literally split in the middle of its campus. Students were like, okay, if we go to the cafeteria, I'm in one district. When I go back to my dorm, I'm in another district. And if you move, if you're a freshman, and then your sophomore year, they move you to the other side, guess what? You're in another district. I mean, communities should be kept whole. A&T is a community of students. They have a lot in common at A&T as students. So to be completely split down the middle to satisfy a political party, yeah, it's just wrong. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more. All right, why should you care about gerrymandering? When your communities are split, your voting power and representation is split too. Unfortunately, this happens a lot in our Black communities, Black and Brown communities. Legislators are less concerned with communities they're supposed to represent, some taking their reelection for granted. Doing these presentations throughout the state, I've actually been in hosting some of these redistricting workshops, and I've been told, oh, I try to speak to my representative. They say they don't have to listen to me because, you know what, due to their districts, they're going to be reelected anyway, which is very unfortunate. Our tax dollars are used by state legislators to defend gerrymanders in court. Due to constant court cases, our voting districts change far more often than they should, creating confusion. The 2011 map started, then it went to court. And I think 2017, it was another shift. 2019, it was another shift. So you're talking about constantly voters are shifting back and forth into different districts, which causes confusion. In recent years, computer mapping software has made it easy for legislators to draw gerrymanders with extreme precision. I mean, all the way from a bird's eye view, using anything from medium income, how you vote, the demographics of neighborhoods. So literally with precision cutting these voting districts. Through gerrymanders, state legislators are literally picking their voters. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about our court case. I can't see anyone, so I hold with my screen up. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about our court case, which is started in November. It's been a long road. We did challenge the legislative and congressional maps on claims of extreme partisan gerrymandering, and we ultimately won. The original congressional and legislative maps diluted the strength of Black voters in North Carolina. These gerrymandered maps split communities for the benefit of political gain and unconstitutionally deprive Black voters of a voice in choosing their representatives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now. So, I mean, and then I have to point in those original maps, which has been changed through legal action through our lawsuit. But the original maps would have possibly had up to 25% of the current Black lawmakers have very likely been drawn out of their districts, just just not able to win re-election. Long-term U.S. Representative G.K. Butterfield's district, it was also so gerrymandered, he had chosen not to seek re-election. Losing, North Carolina would be losing an 18-year congressional veteran and former chair of the Black Legislative Caucus. Since that would have also put, for the first time in nearly 30 years, the northeastern part of North Carolina wouldn't have been represented by a person of color. I just want to show, like, just tell a little bit about the effects of those original maps. Then you have the triad. It was split into, in the triad is Greensboro, Winston-Salem, High Point area, which was split into 3 congressional districts, which diluted votes of community members. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project gave North Carolina the original maps a grade F overall for their maps, citing significant Republican advantage, just straight out, according to the Princeton Gerrymandering Project, partisan gerrymandering. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Now I want to move to, this was the original, I'm just giving an overview of what the original congressional map was, with the North Carolina's largest county. So the Congressional District Map is best understood as like a single organism, given that the boundaries drawn for a particular congressional district in one part of the state will necessarily affect the boundaries drawn for districts elsewhere in the state. So the court found that the cracking and packing of Democratic voters in Guilford, Mecklenburg, and Wake counties had ripple effects throughout the map. I will talk about Mecklenburg particularly. This blue area here was District 12, which is definitely has been packed. Majority of that district had been packed in with Black voters, as well as majority Democratic voters in that district. They had also split Mecklenburg 3 different ways. Yes, Mecklenburg has to be split in terms of a congressional map because of our population, but it didn't have to be split 3 ways. And then it was also connecting with communities more in rural areas that just had different wants, needs, concerns of Mecklenburg County. That was the original congressional map. Okay, this is the new congressional map. Wake and Mecklenburg counties are only split once. Gifford County is kept whole. And the Princeton Gerrymandering Project actually found the congressional map now to be an overall grade of B. The remedial Senate districts were graded an overall grade of an A, as well as the remedial North Carolina House districts, which was graded an overall A. Now in the congressional districts, once the maps were resubmitted by the legislator, the North Carolina Supreme Court accepted the remedial maps from the Senate for the Senate districts and for the House districts, but they had a special master draw. They did not accept the maps that for the congressional had a special master draw those maps. And that's all I have for my presentation. I'll stop sharing so I can see everybody. And if you have any questions, definitely.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was very informative. Gerrymandering is just really something that actually really does cripple us. I'm not sure what's worse, voter suppression or gerrymandering. I think they run neck and neck in terms of how damaging they can be. At this time, we're going to welcome our next panelist, Miss Andrea Miller, who is the founding board member, executive director of People Demanding Action, founding president, National Women's Political Caucus of Virginia, and a member of the Democracy and Governance Working Group of the Virginia Green New Deal. Andrea is an IT and political director, a digital and election strategist. From 2013 to 2015, she led the Progressive Round phone banks and texting program and table on Capitol Hill, bringing together members of Congress, activists, and nonprofit leaders. Her expertise is in voting rights, Climate and the Equal Rights Amendment. She has successfully advocated for legislation on both the federal and state level. In 2008, she was the Democratic nominee for the Virginia 4th Congressional District. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome Miss Andrea Miller, and thank you so much for joining. We're always appreciative of having you as a panelist, and we acknowledge all of the work that you've done around this particular topic.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you very, very much. I brought a presentation as well. So what I'm going to be talking about is what we can do about this situation that we currently find ourselves in regarding voter suppression. So let's just do that. And we are going to get that presentation up. So as they mentioned, I'm with Center for Common Ground. We run a number of different campaigns, and we have 4 ongoing voting rights campaigns. Reclaim Our Vote, where we've got activists in what we call non-focus states. Vote Your Power, which is what our democracy centers run, and they are in our focus states for GOTV turnout, and then our internship program, Students for Justice. And depending upon where you were in North Carolina in 2020, you may have seen some of our billboards. We educate and empower underrepresented voters, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color who are in voter suppression states. And we help them engage in elections and advocate for their right to vote. Because we operate as a 501c3, so the nonpartisan is very, very important to us. We are partnered with a number of national faith groups, among them the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, UU The Vote from the Unitarian Universalist, United Church of Christ, the Workers' Circle, American Ethical Union. We do a lot of state work with Faithful Democracy. And one other partner I'm going to bring up is Vote Riders. Vote Riders is an organization that helps people understand what voter photo ID is required to vote in their state on one side. And on the other side of the card is a phone number for a man-eating attorney in the event either your state does not require voter ID or you have one of the acceptable voter IDs and people are trying not to allow you to vote. Now, in 2020, we had 44,000 volunteers. We have 47,000 this year, and we are hoping that some of the people on this call may make it 60,000. We did not work in the primaries. These are our numbers from the election in November. We contacted 14 million voters. We sent 9.4 million postcards, 2.9 million text messages, and made 1.7 million phone calls. We are imagining in 2022 that our outreach, because we are doing work in the primaries, is going to very nearly need to double. Now, in North Carolina in 2020, we sent 2.9 million postcards to voters. We sent voter registration postcards, pledged to vote postcards, and get out the vote postcards. We sent 711,000 text messages and basically made 411,000 phone calls. Our phone banks and postcarding to North Carolina have already started. And I will put my contact information in the chat so that if you wish to be involved, you can. We believe at Center for Common Ground in the power of the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander vote. And as a matter of fact, many other people believe in it too. So when we look at the 9 states where we are going to be working in 2022, I want you to notice that the great state of Texas, Florida, and Louisiana are already majority minority states. And this is voting age population. We are not waiting for children to age into becoming voters. Those 3 states are already there. North Carolina is currently 39.10% BIPOC. Now, here's the issue we're running into in North Carolina. Now, one of the things that we are working to change is how people talk about voting and voting registration. Number one, no one should ever say register to vote. We have plenty of people who are registered, they just don't vote. Our terminology must become register and vote. It is a 2-step process. And if you want to be excited about who's on the ballot in November, you will be voting in 2 different elections. You will be voting in the primary election, which will be held sometime between March and August. This year, North Carolina's primary is May 17th. And I want you to look at these numbers. Right now, and this is as of this morning, 495,000 African Americans are really in danger of being dumped from the rolls because they have not voted in the last 3 elections. So if you wonder, how do voters get selected for purging? Some voters ask to be removed from the rolls. Other voters get removed from the rolls by not participating in elections. So please, if your organization does voter registration, you're going to change 2 things that you say. You are going to be asking people to register and vote. And the other thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be asking people, is your voter registration up to date? Because plenty of people are going to tell you they're registered and they are no longer registered. They have not checked and they are not aware that they have been removed from the rolls. That is why it is so critical to get people to vote early, because in North Carolina, when you show up to vote early, if it turns out you've been removed from the rolls, you can get back on and vote all at the same time. We have another 249,000 African Americans that are one of 3. I call these presidential year only voters. The only problem is, let's say you're sick during one of those presidential years, you could very easily fall into that 0 for 3 and potentially be on that pre-purge list. 2 of 3 and 3 of 3 are very consistent voters. So looking at these figures, 38% of African Americans do not participate in primaries. When we look at the general, they've already purged the people who were on the inactive list for not voting. That's why nobody's listed as being 0 for 3. They've already been dumped off the rolls. So when we look at the 1 of 3, If something happens, they could be gone next election cycle. We're again looking at 39% of African Americans who do not participate in the general election. Let's add another 47,000 Asian voters, and let's add another nearly 50,000 Hispanic voters. Well, actually, I should really only be doing the 1 of 3 because I don't have an O of 3. The number of voters who do not vote in non-presidential years are more than enough to win any election. Now, what's on the ballot in North Carolina in 2022? Senate, US House, your state executive offices, and 170 seats in your state legislature. That's all in the 2022 election. When we look at North Carolina by the numbers, 1.4 million voters are Black, 221,000 are Hispanic, 103,000 are AAPI. Your big number is your Caucasian or white voters, 4.5 million, and 50,000 Native Americans. North Carolina is 39% BIPOC. We normally look at states. If there are 20% BIPOC voters, in theory and by the numbers, we should be able to win any statewide election. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to need to go very, very soon. And I'm going to drop my email in the chat so that if you want to get in touch with me about working with Center for Common Ground, you now actually have a way. So thank you very much. We have our own event every Thursday night at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to have to run. So I will send this presentation to your organizers and they will be able to make it available to you later. But again, North Carolina is an amazing, amazing state. I know there are amazing, amazing people in this room. So let's work together and let's make sure that we preserve and begin to expand voting rights in the great state of North Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, we have an awful lot of work to do. We are so thankful to you as our panelists, also Alexandra Wolfson, Rotrina Campbell. We are so grateful for your input and the incredible work you're doing on behalf of all who are committed to this effort. Thank you, attendees, to your dedication to this work and further the development of an equitable democratic process. We'll take some time now to answer questions from the audience. And I did see that we had at least one question in the chat. So I'll go ahead and, so this one may be for Rotrina. How can we as citizens be involved in the fight against gerrymandering?
I definitely say holding your representatives accountable. I know at Common Cause, we would constantly send emails about the process, about what's going on, about the meetings the redistricting committees are holding, making sure that you can view those also, and just keeping up with what's going on in there. I know also joining with other organizations that are doing the work, and connecting with them, volunteering, being a part of their petition. I mean, I know everybody has different roles of how comfortable they may feel with being a part of a movement, is what I'll call it. So also writing letters to your representatives, doing an op-ed about what's going on in your community regarding gerrymandering and redistricting, as well as, yes, I already said that, but finding out who's in those committees, actually, like there's a redistricting committee, and finding out who's on those committees and reaching out to them as well. Holding open forums. Right now, of course, the primary is coming up. Ask them in them open forums, how do they feel about redistricting? How do they feel about gerrymandering? What plans or changes do they plan to make if elected or re-elected in those areas? So I think that is very important. And also organizing with other folks who feel the same way you do, bringing more than one voice to that table on the same issue when you do reach out. So those are some ways.
The next question is, please make this, or comment, please make this presentation available to us as soon as possible. We are in great need of targeted data like this to share widely. We've recorded this Zoom for further distribution, and also Andrea Miller committed to sending us her presentation. Rotrina, is it possible for us to get a copy of your presentation?
Sure, yes.
Okay.
I'll send over a copy.
Okay, so the slide decks you saw will be sent as follow-up. Thank you so much for answering that question. Mecklenburg County's Board of Education Vice Chair, Thelma Byers-Bailey, and You Can Vote organizer Brandon Rivers spoke at last week's hearing about the importance of civic engagement in order to empower potential voters who may not even be aware that there is a primary election occurring in May. What kind of actions work best to engage busy, disenfranchised, neglected neighbors so that they become forever voters and build power? Wow, that is a great question. Rotrina, since you answered the last one, Alexandra, how about you try that one?
Sure, it's a great question. And one of the things that we've seen community advocates have a lot of success in is linking the importance of voting and voting rights to other issues that are affecting people on a day-to-day basis. And really, voting is the fundamental way that people are elected and policy is enacted. So there's no shortage of opportunities to show the connection between who our representatives are, who their accountable are, and what the policies in place are. One I know just sort of off the top of my head from a community advocate is talking about housing, especially at the local level where local elected officials have so much power over housing laws and zoning regulations in a way that really tangibly affect people's day-to-day lives. That's a really powerful way to show the link between voting and civic engagement and the way we live.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I almost wish I had the secret sauce and the magic bullet as far as how to engage people. And so it's always this thing of we know and we understand all of the inequity involved, and we know the power of voting. And sometimes I wish I just had a bullhorn where I could sit out my window and just say, go out and vote. I don't know if that would be effective either, but that's why these discussions are so important, and that's why it's so important to take these things in account and this wisdom that we have here on this panel. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Reverend Sadler for his closing remarks. Thank you, panelists, for your time.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much for this conversation this evening. This has been a rich conversation, to be sure. I'm so grateful for Alexandra really lifting up this notion of there is a way past disenfranchisement. We are not left without hope. There is hope that we can overcome this by working together, overcoming the way that minoritized people have been targeted. Rotrina, I'm so excited that you have explained to us gerrymandering. What does it mean to crack, and what does it mean to pack, and how we can begin to approach our legislators and ask them for different kinds of districts that are fair representations, districts that they don't pick their own voters, but that the voters can pick them more equitably and more fairly. Andrea Miller did a fine job of explaining to us the work that needs to be done, the kinds of work that needs to be done on that grassroots level, making sure that we are all engaged in sending out postcards, being involved in phone banking, getting texts out to remind people that they don't just need to register to vote, they need to register and vote. This work that we have to do is not beyond us. It's not something that will overcome us, but we will overcome it if we work together, if we put our backs to the wall and work together towards a better future where everyone's rights are respected, their lives are protected, because we recognize that each and every human being, regardless of the color of their skin, is equally valuable in this great democracy of ours. We've learned a lot over these past weeks where we've been focusing on the racialization of voting rights, but there's so much more work that needs to be done. As we continue on with the work of the Reimagining America Project, in the next several weeks, we will talk more about the way that power has been used in political circles to utilize that power against Black and brown folks, but how we can utilize power to ensure that the ability to effectuate change in our community is protected. We're also going to hear from our other committees, Education Subcommittee, our Criminal Justice Subcommittees, our work with the Environmental Justice Committees. We'll hear from them as well as we continue the work that we need to do. In essence, what we believe with the Reimagining America Project is that every system in our society needs to be examined so that we can get rid of the way that race has shaped us and move towards a more just, more equitable, more fair America that truly lives up to its democratic ideals. You know that one, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that every human being created in God's image is created equally. I want to say thank you right now for all of you who have joined us. And before I close out in prayer, I'd like to see the last couple of slides, just so I can let you see those groups that are working right now towards this kind of positive change. I just want you to take a look right now if you are interested in getting involved. All of these groups and so many more are involved in doing the kind of work that we need to see done in the state of North Carolina. I encourage you to take one of these names down to get a copy of the work that they do from its webpage and see if you can participate in some way. We're so grateful for groups that were highlighted tonight: A Common Cause, the Center for Common Ground, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. But these are just a few of the many groups that are out there. And even here in Charlotte, groups like Action NC that are doing that hard work on the ground, Democracy and doing that work across the state of North Carolina. Progress NC, another group that I've been particularly appreciative of for the work that they've been able to do. There's so much that we can do if we work together. Thank you all for your involvement tonight, and we invite you to come back and join us as we move forward. And if you've missed any of our hearings, any of our parts of this series, you can find them all thanks to the brilliant hard work of Ms. Erin Mills and Ms. Maddie Anderson. You can find all of these videos, all of our presentations on the Reimagining America YouTube channel. I encourage you all to take a look at that. Let's close with a word of prayer. Holy One, we remain eternally grateful to you for all that you do, and that you have not left us without a witness, have not left us without a voice. Though society may array itself against your people, we stand with all a better reality that should be. As we come, ask that you would use us for your purposes to make that should be not just a could be, but a will be as we go forward. Thank you for all that you do. Always use us for your purposes. We call on you by many names, and all of them we are grateful to you. Amen, amen, and amen.